I view him really as kind of the ultimate dignitary in the game of basketball, and really one of the ultimate dignitaries in sports, really in sports history. Just the combination of what he was able to accomplish on the court and off the court is really, really remarkable and really unique. So looking off the court, he was a very influential figure in the civil rights movement. Is obviously one of the things that comes immediately to mind. He was one of the early Black players in the league, and he wasn't. I think he was somewhere in the range of maybe the 12th or 13th Black player in the league, first Black superstar, first Black head coach, and Hall of Fame inductee. He kind of broke all these barriers as he was coming up and establishing his superstardom and his dominance in the game.
Welcome everyone to another episode of The Hobby. Today I am joined by my friend in Cardboard Veritas on Instagram, also known as Nate. Nate, we're grateful to have you on. It's a time that nobody wants to be able to talk. Nobody wants to be talking about some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. We lost one of the great pioneers in the history of basketball, a great man and a great player, and somebody who I know a lot of us not only collect but hold a certain reverence for, and that's Bill Russell. We lost him earlier last week, and I'm excited to talk to you about the life of Bill Russell and about some of his accomplishments. But first off, really just want to ask you, what were your first thoughts as you heard about Bill Russell's passing?
Sure. Obviously, you feel sadness in that moment. I actually found out at a really interesting time. I was at the National Card Show this past weekend, and news of his passing started to emerge. I think it was around noon on Sunday, the last day of the show. And so I found out actually just as my son and I were leaving the show, just moments before we left. So it was kind of, already a time where we had, sort of spent the weekend being around fellow sports fans and card collectors, and, had a little bit of sadness that was over, and then heard that news. And, it was first reactions, of course, are sadness. And, my son and I spent a lot of time talking about it. And even for someone, like Bill Russell at age 88, when you hear that news, it's still just hard to believe. He's always been with us for as long as you and I have been alive, probably combined. And so you just start to process it, and so over time, you move from sadness to kind of celebrating who he was and what he represented. It's been a lot of that over the last few days.
Yeah, and that's really what we're here to do today too, I think, is to talk about not just how sad it is, but mostly let's talk about Bill Russell. Let's talk about why he's important to our history, why he's important to the history of the NBA, and also talk about, this is a card podcast. Let's talk about from a perspective of collectors, why he's been important in the world of cardboard. When I thought about who I wanted to interview for this, you were the first person who I thought about. And the reason that I thought about you is that early on in Basketball Card Fanatics history, we were looking for different people to write different vintage pieces. And you and I got talking, and it was very early on. I think it was issue 4 or issue 5. And you wanted to write a piece about Bill Russell, and you volunteered for it. And a couple weeks later, you sent me this document that was really awesome. I mean, we get a lot of different people write a lot of different things for BCF, but yours was well thought out. It was long, and it covered not only Russell's playing days, but also some of the things that he's accomplished post his career. And so, with that backdrop, that's why I was interested in having you back on. So with all that said, let's start by talking about a little bit about who Bill Russell was on the court. When I say his name and we think about what he did during his career, and what first comes to your mind?
Yeah, so right, he's part of and he's probably the earliest player that remains part of these great debates that we have as sports and basketball fans, right? He came into the league.
The pantheon.
Yeah, he's in the pantheon for sure. He's in everyone's top 10. He's squarely in my top 10 players of all time. And probably a fair bit higher than that. So, I look at his career, and some of the things that stand out to me are obviously the winning. That's the main thing. He has 11 rings, and one of the things there is people say, well, it was a lot easier back then, but ask Wilt if it was easy. I think he had 2, or Jerry West or Oscar Robertson. I think they each had 1, or Elgin Baylor, who never won one.
Never won one.
Those 4 icons of the game combined for 4, and Bill Russell had 11. So, it wasn't that easy, and one of the reasons it was so hard for those guys is they kept running into Russell, and it wasn't easy for him either. It's, it's not like the Celtics were, far and away the best team. That they put together a tremendous dynasty, but they played a lot of game 7s, and, they lost their share of games, but he was a guy that always found a way, and they never won before he got there. So, it's amazing. You have to start with the winning and talk about that and then move on from there, I think.
So you mentioned game 7s. I saw this stat on Twitter as people have been reminiscing about him, and it was how many game 7s Russell played in, how many of them he lost. He played in, I believe the answer was 10 over the course of his career. I remember for sure the number that he lost, the number is 0. He didn't lose in game 7s, but not only was it, game 7s that he didn't lose in, he didn't lose in any deciding games back in high school, back in college. You take Russell all the way through his entire basketball playing career, and he played in something like 20 elimination games. He never lost any of them. He just won every time he had to. And I think, you're exactly right that what people do is they look and they say, oh, it was a smaller league. There were fewer teams. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
And Russell played with a lot of great players, and that's true. He played with several Hall of Famers, but 11 rings. You think it's over a decade of just winning. 11 out of 13 years the guy won. So, I feel like it's such a staggering stat that people almost ignore it because it's not something that we can sort of conceive of.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yep. Right. And then, you look beyond that at, I think he won 5 MVP awards, which is just behind MJ and Kareem, who each have 6. And there was not a finals MVP award at the time. It's now named for him, fittingly, because I think I've heard estimated that he probably would have won at least 8 or maybe 9 finals MVPs if that had existed at the time. And so you look at combined finals and regular season MVPs, and he'd probably have a number that's around 13, 14, 15, somewhere in there. And that's a number that people sometimes use to measure the greatness of an NBA career, right? And MJ's number is 11. He has 5 regular season and 6 postseason. Russell would have been around 14. LeBron and Kareem are next to 8 total regular season and finals. So, by that measure, he was, fairly clearly the best. So you look at titles, you look at combined MVPs. One of the other really interesting things that I like is the 1962 season was a really interesting MVP race year. That was the year that Wilt averaged over 50. He scored 100 in a game. That was in 62. Also in 1962, Oscar Robertson became the first player to average a triple-double. But the MVP that year was Bill Russell, right? And the voting wasn't close, and the players voted. Like, I think most of the players in the league at that time. And so you look at how good was he? What did his peers think of him? And Wilt's best season and Oscar's triple-double season, Bill was the MVP.
Man, I that's just a great stat. I love that. I don't want you to name your list, but you mentioned earlier that he's high up on your top 10. Can you tell us where you have him in the top 10 without sort of listing off the rest of it?
Right. For me, I typically have him, I think, around 4 or 5-ish, so
Okay.
somewhere right in that range. Yeah.
I have him, I'll tell you, I have him at third. And I think though that anywhere in that second to 2 to 5 or 6 range, I think all of those are really like easy to argue. What isn't okay with me is when people look at his career and they say, it doesn't matter, he's older, I'm going to put him, a lot lower. I think people think that in the 1950s, in the early 60s, these guys were playing, just this big man basketball where they were all lumbering. Go watch Bill Russell play. There's not like great video out there, but watch him like jump, watch him run, watch him dribble with the ball. This was a man who was not just like a lumbering stand in the center and score guy, although he was one of the leading rebounders of all time and scored a fair amount as well. Like he was a guy who did other things on the court. He was athletic. He was extremely athletic and extremely long, and would be toward the top of the all-time list in block shots today if they had tracked those things. So I think sometimes when things are out of our mind, when we're not educated on them, we don't focus on them. Maybe we don't understand them as well. But that's part of the reason for this episode of the Hobby, is to also sort of educate those listeners who maybe don't know as much about the life and the career of Bill Russell. Speaking about the life of Bill Russell, for however successful he was on the court, I think some people would argue that what he did off the court, in terms of civil rights and other things, those were maybe just as impactful. You wrote about some of these things in your article, and we've talked about some of them. But when you think about what Russell did for the world outside of the game of basketball, what are some of the things that come to your mind?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I view him really as kind of the ultimate dignitary in the game of basketball, and really one of the ultimate dignitaries in sports, really in sports history. Just the combination of what he was able to accomplish on the court and off the court is really, really remarkable and really unique. So looking off the court, he was a very influential figure in the civil rights movement. Is obviously one of the things that comes immediately to mind. He was one of the early Black players in the league, and he wasn't. I think he was somewhere in the range of maybe the 12th or 13th Black player in the league, first Black superstar, first Black head coach, and Hall of Fame inductee. He kind of broke all these barriers as he was coming up and establishing his superstardom and his dominance in the game. So he was, kind of a pioneer in the game and in sports in that regard. And then off the court, he was marching beside, Dr. King in civil rights marches. He was standing with Muhammad Ali in his, some of the very important and influential stands that he was taking in the civil rights movement. Bill Russell also, he famously, there was a game, I can't recall what year it was, but it was fairly early in his career. I want to say around 1960 or 1961. And they were going to play an exhibition game in Kentucky. And there was a restaurant there that refused to serve a couple of his teammates, including Sam Jones, for based on their race. And in response to that, Russell led a boycott of that game, and they didn't end up playing. And you think sort of reverberations forward. We saw that not too long ago in the wake of what happened to George Floyd, and some of the decisions that players made in the NBA. And you think about making those decisions 60 years earlier when things were very different, and the difficulty in making those kind of decisions. And, you hear the phrase, be the change that you want to see in the world. And I think he's someone that very, very fully stands for that type of principle.
That's a great story to tell, and a great, I think, conclusion and lesson to draw. I know that there's a story about him and his his Hall of Fame induction that is well known, but it doesn't really immediately come to my mind right now. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Well, one thing that comes to mind for me is when his number was retired in Boston, that he didn't attend the ceremony. He famously is that, yeah,
I think that's
right. Yeah, he had a very strained relationship and kind of view of the city of Boston. He endured a lot of racism during his career and also, kind of, I think, felt a little slighted by the city for what he had accomplished there. And I think he felt like he didn't maybe get the full level of respect and credit that he deserved for what he had done. So yeah, they of all things, can you imagine having a number retirement ceremony with the recipient of that ceremony refusing to attend? So yeah, that was what he did, on principle there, and in large part as a reaction to how he felt about the city of Boston. And I'm not sure to what degree those feelings changed. And he had great reverence for, obviously, tremendous number of people there and his teammates and the organization, but there was some real difficulty that he experienced, and felt toward some fairly large swath of the fan base and the population there that I'm not sure he ever fully worked through. So.
These things that he did, both refusing to play in a basketball game where a couple of his teammates couldn't eat at a local establishment, and then not showing up for a jersey retirement. Those aren't comfortable things to do, especially for somebody who obviously finds himself in the minority and who is taking a stand for not only for himself, but for his people. And let's face it, these are not athletes that were being paid in the mid 60s and the late 60s, what they're being paid today. And foregoing some of those benefits as a player, potentially having, your employer be extremely unhappy with you. Those are real sacrifices. And I don't think that we always recognize that if he had just said, "Oh, I'll just play. It's no big deal." Like, that would have been the far easier thing to do. But instead he walked the road less traveled. He did the hard thing. And to me, that, that's like really the mark of greatness, when people are willing to sacrifice on behalf of, a cause. I think those are amazing stories. Do you have any other stories that you want to share on some of the post-career things that made Russell as great as he was?
Yeah, right. Post-career is interesting to think about too, because a couple things come to mind. He was a great mentor to many players after he retired. And one that always stands out that I've heard some stories about is his relationship with Kobe Bryant, which that they had a very close mentor-mentee relationship, and we're in touch a fair bit. And one of the things that Russell appreciated was that Kobe was a student of the game in ways that I think Russell saw some reflections of himself. And one example, I think, was Kobe had read Bill Russell's book, and Russell had spoken in his book about scouting his own teammates and wanting to really deeply understand their games, and by doing so, learn how he could help to make them better in order to help the team be better in order to win more. And so Kobe came to Russell and wanted to talk to him about that, and what was his process and his approach to figuring that out so that Kobe could implement it. And that was something that Russell really appreciated. And he was always a huge Kobe fan, and they had just I think a really great relationship, and saw that ultimate competitor spirit and student of the game in each other in a way I think that was really neat.
That is a great story. And I think that Kobe's not the only one. The image that everybody sort of has come to their mind of Russell in the last few years is when Russell, I think, flipped off Charles Barkley. Was it Chuck? Is that who he flipped off?
I think that sounds right. Yeah.
It's a playful thing, but Russell had relationships with a lot of key and important people, and I think he was a mentor for a lot of people. Again, I think that comes back to the being willing to sacrifice and be yourself thing. As we look at his career, we look at his post career. The other thing that I think that we think of now as collectors is, how do I want to think about Russell? What do I want to have as a collector to represent Russell in my collection? And I know everybody has different thoughts on this. Some people don't want to own something of somebody after they pass away because they feel like, that there's something strange about that. But for me, I'm a collector of the history of the game, right? And so I think about Russell cards and think about them being like important to me personally. We haven't really talked about this at all, but I wonder, as you look at your collection, do you have pieces in your collection that you feel like represent him in your collection well, or are there cards that you would like to be able to sort of obtain? And especially as you've had a chance to think about him over the course of the last few days since his passing, how does that translate into how you think about collecting?
Sure. Yeah. And I have given that some thought, actually. And one of the things and idea that it's really helped to solidify for me is that one of the really sort of neat things about collecting is that one of the ways that I collect, and I think you share this, and many do, is that we like to collect cards. Obviously we're focused on cards, primarily cards of people that we admire.
Right.
And and he's very clearly one of he's someone that I've collected heavily and really enjoyed collecting. And big part of that is because of my admiration for the things we just talked about, what he's done on and off the court, and just one of the huge lions of the game and of sport and of the civil rights movement, and his character, even just watching him interviewed, his laugh. And another really kind of neat thing was I grew up a Magic Johnson fan. You can see him behind me here, but I went back at one point and watched that famous game from Magic's rookie season where he stepped in and played center when Kareem got hurt. And Bill Russell was the announcer for that game, which was so neat, to see him call that game and just kind of hear his personality shine through in an environment like that. But, so it's someone that you kind of admire. And I feel like the collecting piece, in terms of what I've been thinking about there, it brings you closer to that, and so you talk to other collectors who collect similar things and collect similar people, and you have great discussions about someone like Bill Russell, and in the course of collecting you become more interested in that person and what they've done. And so over these past few years, especially collecting some of his cards, it has, I feel like, gotten me closer to and a better understanding of who he was and what he meant and what he accomplished. And so I do a lot of vintage collecting, and so that's been my real focus, is some of his his stuff from his playing days. And the one of the huge sort of grail cards for me was getting his rookie card from the 1957 top set. I have that now, and it's one of the real centerpieces of my collection, and one of my favorite cards that I have. It was from the first Topps basketball set in 1957. Really rare card. I guess it's all relative, but rare compared to most cards of that time, and rare compared to every card now, if you include parallels. I think there are about 1,000 of them in the PSA population report. So you think about his significance, the significance of that card, and there's only 1,000 of his rookie cards. I consider that pretty rare. So that card, and then the ones from the 61 Fleer set come immediately to mind as some that I have and really cherish.
I know in your article in BCF about his 3 original cards, you talked about some of the pieces of the photography that were interesting, some of the technical aspects of the card that might have been interesting. 57 is the one that everybody's going to think about. right? Even though he only has 3 original mainstream cards, 57 is the rookie card, and it's the one. It's one of the, in my opinion, it's one of the 6 or 7 most iconic basketball cards ever made. Other than being his rookie, what are 2 or 3 things about that card that really stand out to you?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it's pretty neat that it shows him in a defensive stance, on ball, playing some on ball defense and probably about to block someone's shot. Um, and, so I really like that aspect. That's what he was known for. And he's generally considered to be the best defensive player who's ever played the game. I saw at one point defensive win shares number, and he's the all-time leader in that statistic, and it's not close. I think Tim Duncan is a very distant second. And you could probably put the careers of 2 other really good defensive players in that gap between Duncan and Russell when you look at their defensive win shares. So seeing him play defense on his rookie card and knowing how he revolutionized the game in that way, I think is a really neat element. It's also kind of interesting in that the other 3 players that are pictured on the card are all white players, and we talk about him, being a pioneer in the game, and so you see him pictured as the only Black man on the card, and it gives you a little bit of context for who he was and how he fit into the evolution of the game.
Great comments. When I think about the 57 Topps card, I don't have as great of thoughts as you do, because I owned it and I don't own it anymore. And I wish that I did, because like I said, I think it's one of the most important basketball cards ever made. 57 Topps is, as you pointed out, actually a fairly rare set. It's not like it's impossible to find, but when you compare it to other cards, even cards at the time, and you said that really well. For example, 61 Fleer. There's a whole lot more 61 Fleer than there is 57 Topps. A whole lot more. Yeah. Not that 61 Fleer is super common or anything, but it's a lot more common than 57 Topps is. I owned a PSA 2 of the Russell that was also a PSA DNA card, and I owned it back in, I think about 2018, maybe 20. Yeah, I think about 2018 is when I owned that card, and I had it for a short time and then was saving money for something else. And so I sold it. But really, like over the course of the last year, maybe the last year and a half, I thought about acquiring back another card, probably not a PSA DNA, just because a lot of those have gotten kind of expensive in decent grades. Not that a 2 was, a high point, but even finding a 2 or a 3 at this point with an autograph is really expensive. Yeah. Even finding one that's not autographed is still really expensive. And so, that's one that I would like to really add at this point. Yeah. And honestly, like for me, that's the big card. I would like to own a 57. I would like to own some 61s as well, just because I think it's neat, as you pointed out, that he only has those 3 original mainstream cards. But really the card that I would like to add most, that I probably will never get to add, is a 68 Topps test card. That particular card, he is featured with his arm fully extended in like a defensive sort of stance, right? Like you described with the 57, except for he is showing off sort of his wings, right? It reminds you of what it would actually be like to be guarded by this guy. And you see in this image, he is not lumbering. He is not some big heavy set center. He is a dominant athlete. You can tell just as soon as you look at this card. So as far as original cards go, that's really that's most of his canon, as we call it. What other cards does he have from his playing days that people maybe don't think as much about?
Sure. Yeah. And just to pick up on one of your other points, I do really like that about the Topps test card, that sense of his athleticism that you can see in that card. And the other one that's like that from his playing days is his inaction 61 Fleer card, where, he's the greatest lefty of all time. And he's just kind of gliding through the air with his arm outstretched. It almost, just, you see that photograph initially and you don't think it really can even be real. But he actually did that. Like you said, go watch some footage, and he flew through the air like that. And so that, you get a sense of his athleticism there as well. So, you know, in terms of other playing days cards, besides the four we've mentioned, the rookie card from 57, the portrait and the inaction from 61, and the 68 Topps Test, the only other prominent one that comes to mind for me is the 1955 All-American card. And that's a very small hand-cut portrait card. I believe it was quite a large set, actually, and featured players from all different sports. I think it may have had 500 people and 500 athletes in the set. So really, really quite large. But, you know, just like the Topps Test card, exceedingly small population. You know, on the Topps Test, I think there's maybe 10 of them that have been graded by PSA.
Yeah,
And
it's something like that. It might be a few more. It might be like 13, but it's not a big number.
Right, tiny. And the All-American is a little more than that. I want to say it's 25 or 30 or so. So, you know, he's got the three main cards. He has these other two cards. And, you know, these other two cards are virtually non-existent with a total pop below 50. So, you know, it's really the main three. The 55 All-American card is actually, I mean, I don't know if it's technically classified as this, but it's an XRC. You know, it's from his college days. He was at University of San Francisco in 1955 and 1956, unsurprisingly winning championships both years and leading the team. I think it was a 55 game win streak they had over the course of those 2 years. Wow. So he was still a collegiate at that time. You know, the 55 set, his 55 card was kind of a true rookie card after his rookie year. So it's kind of interesting. You know, he has the one kind of XRC, the rookie, the 261 Fleers from his prime, and then the 68 Topps Test, you know, sort of right toward the end of his career. And those are, you know, really kind of the main ones from when he played.
When you break it down in that way, the way that it makes me feel is, oh, that is an incredibly small number of total cards for anybody, let alone somebody. I mean, he didn't play. This isn't somebody from the teens or the 20s like we see in baseball. He played in the last 70 years, and he only has that many cards total in existence. When you get into his post-playing days, that's when you start seeing some other things. He actually has a card. This just came to me. He has a card from 1975 Topps where he is the coach of the Supersonics. And that's a team card, but it does feature him.
Right.
And then actually, before I get into some of the future things, I want to mention something that I think is a really interesting fact. It might be something that you and I talked about when you were putting together that piece originally. The 1968 Topps Test set came out, and Russell's featured prominently. That set was actually probably the 67-68 set. It's become known as the 68 Topps Test set, but Chamberlain is featured as a 76er, and if that's the case, it should be 67-68 rather than 68-69. Russell then retires, but retires later on. And what's interesting about that is the next year, 69-70, the top set did rulers, like these ruler poster cards. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do, yeah. Kareem has one of those in that set, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a card number from that set. I think it's card number 17. I might be wrong about that. Forget that part. But there's a card number that's missing from that set. And it's believed that was likely meant for Russell. But that upon Russell's retirement, that poster, or that ruler as it is, which is like a fold out, that's like twice the size of these already giant tall boys cards, Russell was then not included in the set. It makes me sort of like, it's one of those cards that could have been sort of things, where you think back and you go, wow, what would it have been like if Bill Russell would have had a poster or would have had a ruler at a 69 Topps Test?
Right.
That just would have been amazing.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that would have been a neat addition to his canon for sure. Yeah. But yeah, so, when you talk about the super low pop, I mean, it really is remarkable with, again, just looking at PSA populations, a little over 1,000 of his rookie, and then the 261 Fleers I reached, their pop's a little over 1,000 as well. There's probably more of those ungraded still. I think the 57 Topps, I think the vast majority of those probably have been graded. There aren't probably too many more of those sitting out there at this point with the value that they have. But, you combine the populations and you're at maybe 3,500 playing base cards, which is just, it's unbelievable. Like you say, for someone of his stature and his recency, I mean, you look at the baseball or football populations from that time. The 52 mantle is, obviously a mythological card, and part of the reason for that is its scarcity, but its PSA population's around 1,800, which is half of Russell's total population. I mean, and almost double his rookie pop. So it's remarkable to think about just how few of his cards are out there.
It makes you think, as I talked about earlier, in terms of education, how important it is. And how, as people become more educated and as they think, oh, I really want to own an original Bill Russell card, or I want to own a rookie, it's cost prohibitive already, but it's also just extremely rare. If you go out there and you look at most of the major auction houses, you're not even going to see one a month that goes up. And that speaks to how rare it is. Moving on past his playing days, if you want to extend his canon, if you will, into those days, you really get into some really interesting in a few interesting highlights, and we'll cover those real quick, and then talk a little bit about more modern cards for Russell. And when I think about a little bit older cards, the first card that actually comes to mind isn't technically a card. It's another one that I used to own, and it's his Hall of Fame bookmark. His Hall of Fame bookmark is really an interesting thing. Again, it's a card that I wish I would have hung on to. It's very long. It's the size of a bookmark. The bookmarks are thin, and it doesn't feature anything on the back. The back is a blank back. But why this is interesting, and this is one of the things I was referring to earlier with his Hall of Fame. There's something about Russell's Hall of Fame that we should sort of look up when we're done with this episode. I believe he's the first Black man to be in the Hall of Fame.
He is. Yeah, that's right.
Does that ring true to you? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think if memory serves, Russell believed that there were other people who also should have been in the Hall of Fame. And so he didn't feel okay about being named to the Hall of Fame as the first Black man. I don't know if he didn't come to his induction. I don't know that story. We'll have to look it up afterwards. What I do know is that these bookmarks were made for a span of years, and every player or every person that's in the set up until Russell was a white man. This included other people that you know of, most notably like John Wooden is in the set. I can't remember if Bob Cousy is in the set. I can't remember. I think that sounds right. But some of the better known, and George Mikan, for example, was in the set. Russell's the first Black man in the Hall of Fame, and so they make this bookmark of him. And that came again after a lot of the other ones were made. So a bunch of them were made, and then every year they would have a few more that they would add. Well, then Russell comes in, and they stop making the bookmarks. They make just a few of Russell, and then they stop making the bookmarks. It's a huge piece, and frankly, that's why it's not in my collection anymore, is because I didn't like to store it. But it's such an interesting story that that they were selling these bookmarks is part of the Hall of Fame experience. You come into Springfield, Massachusetts, and see the little bookmarks there, and you're like, oh, I can pick up this whole package. Oh, I can get the editions. And then the first Black player appears on one with his amazing history, and then they discontinue the set. I just think that's a really, really interesting an interesting collectible if you're a Russell collector. And then you fast forward a few more years, and you get to the era of the early 90s, when you started to see all sorts of different types of sets come out, one of which was Action Packed. Action Packed was an embossed card that was not NBA licensed, but featured the very first autograph of Bill Russell. Now, at that time, I had heard a rumor that Bill Russell, if you ever met him, would say, I can't give you my autograph unless you'll give me $250, or some crazy rumor like this. Did you ever hear that? Or is that something?
I don't recall hearing that. No.
Okay. It's something that I heard at the time. I can't claim whether it's true or not, but he signed a number of these action-packed cards, and they're still incredibly popular today. They sell really well. And then over the next few years, he would appear in various subsets and different things. Upper Deck had him appear in a few different things. But then it's not really until the late 90s that you see his autograph show up really on an NBA licensed product. And this is where we started to see Russell again. Saw him in the Legend set, the Century Legend set, the Retro set. And even though you see him in a lot of those sets, he didn't sign very many cards. These have become, for a lot of collectors who are looking for rare Russell cards, they've become really some of his most sought after. I wish I could say I owned one. I don't own any of those at this point. But they're highly sought after, and Russell continued to sign from those early, from those late 90s, those early days of him signing up until, even in the last couple of years, he's signed. But although he signed a lot of different cards, none of them have ever been in really huge quantities. And in addition to those, we've also seen, like, he's appeared in Prism, and he appeared in Topps Chrome. And so we have refractors and gold refractors and prisms and gold prisms and all of these different sort of parallels and inserts from the modern day. The reason that I love that these things have come out is it allows for people who are modern collectors to sort of get an idea of who Russell was. Hopefully, now that people have had more of a chance to sort of learn about his life, what they've done is they've said, it's kind of cool to look back at some of these cards that maybe I just thought of Russell as like an old time guy, but you hear people talk about him with the reverence that they have. And I just think, I think Russell's career, his life, and everything that he accomplished is incredibly important for the history of basketball. And it's incredibly important for the history of our hobby. And I'm really grateful, Nate, that you were willing to join us today for this conversation about really the life and the career of Bill Russell and a little bit about his basketball cards. Before we go, one last question for you. As you think back, looking at Russell's life and his career, if you had to just draw one or two lessons or one or two things that you'll think about first when you think about him, what would you leave the viewers with?
Sure. Well, yeah, thanks for having me on, Adam. It's, really enjoy the discussion, and, as we said at the outset, kind of talking about him in a celebratory way, and, what he accomplished and what he's meant to, to the game and well beyond that is something that, is meaningful. But yeah, in terms of, a couple things that, really kind of stand out, it's, to me, he represents, kind of that indomitable spirit, and the will to win, and extreme principle and conviction. And so just the power of his personality, the power of his spirit, the power of his will, and the way that he utilized all those things to effectuate winning on the court, to effectuate change in society, and to help advance the careers and the lives of the people that he came into contact with. I think all that stuff is intertwined in the power of the person and the man that he was.
Awesome. I'm grateful that you've been willing to share a little bit of your thoughts. And again, just want to sort of agree with your thoughts on on the way that he lived and how that impacted the world, and on the way that he played and how that impacted the game. Again, Nate, in Cardboard Veritas on Instagram, your perspective has been really valuable, and I just want to thank you again for jumping on today. Next week, next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Pacific, we will drop our next issue of the Hobby. And until then, happy collecting.